Few friendships in the history of music were as powerful, complicated, and emotional as the bond between Paul McCartney and George Harrison. Their story was not just about two musicians who changed the world. It was about two young boys from Liverpool who found family in each other, built a dream together, and later struggled with the weight of fame, ambition, and personal differences. Before millions of fans knew their names, before the world celebrated the Beatles as the greatest band of all time, Paul and George were simply teenagers with guitars, curiosity, and a shared love for music. They were friends who spent hours talking about songs, practicing chords, and imagining a future that seemed impossible. But extraordinary success came with extraordinary pressure. The same friendship that helped create some of the most influential music ever recorded would later face jealousy, frustration, creative disagreements, and years of emotional distance. For decades, many people only saw the public image, the smiles on stage, the legendary albums, and the unforgettable performances. Behind the scenes, however, was a much more complicated story. A story of two friends who loved and respected each other, but who also struggled to understand one another. Years later, Paul McCartney would reflect on George Harrison with honesty and emotion, revealing that beneath the disagreements was a deep connection that never truly disappeared. This is the story of Paul and George, the friendship that survived fame, conflict, and time. Long before Beatlemania changed their lives forever, Paul McCartney and George Harrison were just young musicians searching for something greater than ordinary life. Their friendship began in Liverpool during the 1950s, when both boys were discovering the excitement of American rock and roll. At school, they were not necessarily the closest friends at first, but music created a connection that went beyond their differences. Paul was confident, energetic, and naturally drawn toward performing. He had already developed strong musical abilities through his family background. His father, Jim McCartney, was a musician and bandleader, and Paul had learned piano and developed an ear for melody at an early age. George, on the other hand, was quieter and more reserved. He was not always comfortable in traditional school settings, but music gave him a place where he could express himself. The guitar became his escape, his passion, and eventually his identity. Their friendship grew during long bus rides through Liverpool. Away from classrooms and expectations, they discovered that they shared the same obsession: music. They talked endlessly about rock and roll legends like Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, and Little Richard. The energy and emotion of American music inspired them to pick up instruments and dream about performing themselves. George's dedication stood out. He practiced constantly, often until his fingers hurt, determined to improve. While others saw him as a quiet teenager, Paul recognized something special in him, a natural talent and commitment that could not be ignored. By the mid-1950s, George had already begun performing with local groups. Paul, meanwhile, had become connected with John Lennon and his band, the Quarrymen. When the group needed another guitarist, Paul believed George was the right person. However, John Lennon was uncertain at first. George was younger than the others and looked almost too young to belong beside them. But George quickly proved himself. During a memorable moment on a Liverpool bus, he played the instrumental song Raunchy and demonstrated that his guitar skills were far beyond his age. His talent convinced John and the others that he deserved a place in the group. That decision changed music history forever. The three young musicians, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison, began creating something that would eventually become the Beatles. For Paul, the friendship meant more than just music. After losing his mother as a teenager, the connection he found with his bandmates gave him a sense of belonging. For George, joining the group meant being recognized as an equal among talented musicians he admired. At that moment, none of them could have imagined what was coming. The small Liverpool band would soon become the biggest musical phenomenon the world had ever seen. As the Beatles transformed from a local Liverpool group into international superstars, their lives changed completely. The pressure of constant touring, recording, and worldwide attention tested every relationship within a band. Success brought excitement, but it also created new problems. During the early years, Paul McCartney naturally became one of the group's strongest creative leaders. His perfectionism, musical ambition, and desire to improve every detail pushed the Beatles toward new artistic heights. His dedication helped create masterpieces, but it also created tension. George Harrison, who was once the younger guitarist following the guidance of Paul and John, began developing into a songwriter with his own ideas and artistic vision. The problem was that the Beatles were built around the songwriting partnership of Lennon and McCartney. Their songs dominated albums, radio, and studio time, leaving George struggling to find space for his own compositions. At first, George accepted his role. He respected John and Paul and understood their incredible songwriting partnership. But over time, frustration began to grow. George was no longer just the quiet guitarist standing in the background. He was becoming an artist with his own voice, and he wanted that voice to be heard. Songs he wrote were often overlooked, while Lennon-McCartney compositions received the majority of attention. For George, this was not simply a professional issue. It became personal. He had spent years contributing to the band's success, yet he often felt like he was still fighting for recognition. Meanwhile, Paul's leadership style became increasingly intense. He wanted the Beatles to continue evolving, experimenting, and creating groundbreaking music. But what Paul saw as dedication, George sometimes experienced as control. The two friends were moving in different directions. Paul was focused on musical perfection and pushing boundaries. George was searching for deeper meaning through spirituality, philosophy, and personal exploration. Their differences became more noticeable as the years passed. The world saw four musicians creating revolutionary albums, but behind the scenes, the relationships were becoming more complicated. The friendship that had begun on Liverpool buses was now being tested inside the most famous band on earth. By the late 1960s, the Beatles had reached a level of fame that few artists in history could ever imagine. They were no longer just a successful band from Liverpool. They were a cultural force that influenced fashion, politics, art, and an entire generation. But behind the legendary image, the four members were changing. They were no longer the same teenagers who had dreamed together in Liverpool. Each had developed different interests, different ambitions, and different ideas about what the future should look like. For Paul McCartney, music remained the center of everything. He believed the Beatles still had the ability to create something extraordinary, and he pushed the group to keep working, experimenting, and improving. For George Harrison, however, life had started to become about something much deeper than success. His growing interest in spirituality, meditation, and Indian philosophy changed his perspective. While Paul focused on melodies, arrangements, and studio perfection, George began searching for personal meaning beyond fame. These different paths created a distance between two friends who had once been inseparable. One of the clearest examples of this changing dynamic appeared during the creation of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The album became one of the most celebrated works in music history, with Paul playing a major role in shaping its ambitious concept and sound. It represented the Beatles' ability to transform themselves and push the boundaries of popular music. However, for George, the experience was complicated. His song, Within You Without You, reflected his spiritual journey and his interest in Indian music. The song was deeply personal, representing ideas about life, consciousness, and human connection. While the song became an important part of the album, George sometimes felt that his creative contributions were treated differently from those of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. He was searching for artistic freedom while still being part of a group where two voices had traditionally dominated. The tension continued to grow. In 1968, the Beatles traveled to India to study meditation with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. For George, this was a life-changing experience. He embraced spirituality sincerely and saw it as a path toward understanding himself. Paul, however, approached the experience differently. Although interested, he did not share George's level of commitment. This difference represented something larger between them. George wanted the Beatles to slow down and explore deeper questions about life. Paul wanted to keep creating, recording, and moving forward. Neither perspective was wrong, but they were no longer seeing the world in the same way. The most painful chapter in their friendship came during the recording sessions for what would become the Let It Be album. By this point, years of unresolved frustration had accumulated. The sessions were supposed to capture the Beatles returning to their roots and performing together naturally. Instead, they revealed a band struggling with internal conflicts. The cameras captured tense moments between Paul and George. Paul often took charge in the studio, suggesting arrangements and directing how songs should be played. To Paul, this was part of his commitment to making the music the best it could be. To George, it felt like he was being treated as a supporting musician rather than an equal creative partner. After years of feeling overlooked, George finally reached his limit. During one argument, George expressed his frustration by telling Paul that he would simply play whatever Paul wanted, or not play at all if that was what Paul preferred. The moment represented years of emotions finally coming to the surface. George was not angry because of one disagreement. He was reacting to years of feeling unheard. Behind the scenes, George had been writing songs that showed his growth as a songwriter. Songs like All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity, and Run of the Mill demonstrated a maturity that many people had not yet recognized. But inside the Beatles, there was limited space for his material. The Lennon-McCartney partnership remained the center of the band. Eventually, George made the shocking decision to leave. On January 10th, 1969, he walked away from the group, describing the atmosphere as unhealthy and unhappy. His departure sent a message to everyone involved. Something had to change. After several days away, George returned, but the relationship between the band members had been permanently affected. The wounds were deeper now. Although the Beatles were struggling internally, 1969 also became a turning point for George Harrison's career. During the recording of Abbey Road, George finally received the recognition he had spent years seeking. Two of his songs became among the most beloved Beatles recordings ever created. Here Comes the Sun captured hope,